Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are stripping away centuries of ritual to look at one of history's most misunderstood figures. Was Confucius a prophet? A god? Or was he actually the world's first great secular humanist? We're diving into a translation that suggests this ancient sage didn't care about the supernatural, didn't pray in the traditional sense, and believed that obsessing over spirits was actually harmful. We are exploring the line between religion and philosophy and asking, can you have a moral world without a god?
It's a huge question. And it feels so incredibly modern, doesn't it? But here we are looking at a text that's, 2,500 years old, and it tackles that question head on. To do that, we're looking at the Sayings of Confucius, and specifically the introduction and translation by a scholar named Lionel Giles.
And Giles is really the key here, isn't he? Because when I think of Confucius, and I bet what most of you listening think of him, we have this very specific, almost cartoonish image.
Go on.
I picture this guy in, heavy robes, very stiff, very serious. And he's just reciting these endless lists of rules, like do not sit on a mat that is not straight, or bow at a perfect 45-degree angle. It all feels, it feels like a lot of starch.
Starch is the perfect word for it.
Yeah.
It really is. And that whole reputation, that stiffness, this idea of him as a pedantic rule maker, Giles argues that it's basically a massive historical accident.
An accident.
A translation error, or maybe more accurately, a bias error that's just been passed down for centuries.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we've been reading him wrong for hundreds of years, who do we blame? I mean, how did we get from what you're suggesting is a dynamic philosopher to a stiff etiquette coach?
Well, the blame, or at least the starting point, really lies with the early translators into English, and specifically a man named Dr. Legge. Now, in the world of sinology, that's the study of China. Legge is a giant. You can't ignore his work. But, and this is the crucial part, he was a Christian missionary first and a scholar second.
So he wasn't exactly coming to the text with a blank slate.
Not at all. Giles points out that Legge approached Confucianism with what he calls a foregone conclusion. He went in already believing that whatever he found in these ancient Chinese texts had to be inferior to Christianity.
So he was looking for evidence to support a belief he already held. That's not great scholarship.
It's a huge problem, and you can see it in how he translates key terms. Take the Chinese concept of li.
Li.
Right. Li is this huge foundational concept in Confucianism. It's about ritual, custom, how you interact with people, social harmony. It's massive. Legge translated it as rules of propriety.
Rules of propriety. Yeah, that sounds exactly like etiquette school. It sounds like learning which fork to use for the salad course, or how you're supposed to address a duke.
Exactly. It makes Confucius sound like a dancing master or, a protocol officer at the UN. It completely strips the concept of its philosophical weight. But Giles argues that li is so much deeper than that. It's not just about the external action, the bro or the fork. It's supposed to be an inner principle of harmony and self-control.
An inner principle. So it's not a rule you follow. It's a state of being you achieve.
That's a great way to put it. It's a state of mind where your actions just naturally align with the right thing to do. It's more like an emotional rhythm, not just a rule book.
So it's the difference between, say, someone just memorizing the notes on a page of sheet music and a jazz musician who actually feels the music and can improvise from that feeling.
That is a fantastic analogy, yes. Legge translated the sheet music. Giles is trying to show us the jazz. And because of that really dry rules of propriety translation, the West got this picture of Confucius as this cold, formal, almost unfeeling man. But as we get into the text itself, the man we meet, he seems anything but cold.
Which brings us to the really shocking part of Giles' argument. And honestly, this is the part that totally reframed this whole deep dive for me. If Confucius wasn't this stiff religious figure, what was he? Because Giles seems to be suggesting he wasn't really religious at all in the way we understand it.
That is the absolute core tension of this deep dive. And Giles makes this fascinating comparison to help us get our heads around it. He says, look at the other great world-shaping figures. You've got the Buddha, who offers nirvana, this release from the cycle of rebirth.
Right. A supernatural goal.
Then you have Jesus Christ, who offers heaven and the resurrection.
Another supernatural goal.
And you have Muhammad, who offers paradise. Again, all of them are built around a supernatural reward system.
It's a transaction, basically.
Yeah.
Be good, believe the right things now, and you get the cosmic cookie in the afterlife.
Exactly. The cookie, the cloud, the eternal bliss, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But Confucius, he offers nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing in that sense. There is no promise of a reward in an afterlife. There is absolutely no threat of eternal punishment in a hell. Giles points out that Confucius built this incredible system of morality that acts like a religion. It binds a civilization together, it creates social cohesion, but it contains almost zero supernatural elements.
This is just virtue for virtue's sake.
Essentially, yes. And that is a staggering thought for the time period. You have to remember, we are talking about 500 BC here. The idea that you should be good not because a god is watching you or because you want to get into heaven, but just simply because it is the right human thing to do. It's a completely secular justification for morality.
Okay, that leads us right into the heart of it then, the God question.
Yeah.
Because I think if you ask the average person on the street, was Confucius an atheist? They'd probably say no.
Right. Of course not.
They'd assume he's the head of Confucianism, which they think of as a religion, so he must believe in a god. But you found some quotes in the source material that are, well, they're pretty blunt about his skepticism.
They are startlingly blunt. I mean, there is one line in particular that really just stops you in your tracks. Confucius says, and this is a direct quote from the Giles translation, "Absorption in the study of the supernatural is most harmful."
Wow. Most harmful. Not just a waste of time, not misguided, but actively bad for you. That is a strong condemnation.
It is. It's an incredibly strong stance. And if you connect this to the bigger picture of his philosophy, you can see why he'd think that. Confucius was, above all, a pragmatist. He looked around at the world. And remember, he lived in the chaotic warring states, period. And he just saw enough trouble right here on Earth.
Poverty, war, corrupt officials.
All of it.
Okay.
So he famously asked this question, before we are able to do our duty by the living, how can we do it by the spirits of the dead?
That is such a practical shutdown of the whole conversation. It's like saying, hey, you haven't even figured out how to be a decent neighbor yet, so why are you worrying about ghosts?
Exactly. It points to a kind of agnostic pragmatism. He isn't necessarily saying spirits don't exist. He's not a militant atheist in the modern sense, like a Richard Dawkins or something.
Right.
But he is saying that human beings have no business obsessing over them when there's so much work to do in the here and now. He felt that since we barely understand life, how can we possibly claim to understand death?
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate for a second. He talks about heaven, right? The word is tien, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
He's always referencing the will of heaven. So he wasn't a total materialist who thought the universe was just random atoms bumping into each other.
This is where it gets really, really interesting and where the nuance of the translation matters so much. Yes, he speaks of tien, or heaven, but he doesn't seem to be talking about a personality. He isn't talking about a bearded figure in the clouds who intervenes in your life, checks your bank account, or decides who wins the Super Bowl.
So what is he talking about when he says heaven? If it's not a person, what is it?
There is this beautiful little anecdote in the source material that clarifies this perfectly. A disciple is getting worried. He asks the master, if you don't speak, how will we transmit your doctrines? Basically, if you stop teaching us, what happens to the truth? And Confucius replies with this incredible rhetorical question about God. He says, does God speak?
Does God speak?
The 4 seasons hold on their course, and all things continue to live and grow. Yet, tell me, does God speak?
Wow, that sends a little chill down your spine. It's profound.
It is, isn't it? It completely reframes the whole concept of divinity. He's pointing to the natural order of the universe, the rotation of the seasons, the growth of plants, the basic biology of life. That, for him, is the divine. It operates silently. It doesn't give speeches. It doesn't hand down commandments on stone tablets. It just is.
That sounds a lot like Spinoza. Or deism, this idea that God is the laws of physics, or God is the underlying structure of nature itself.
It's very close to Spinoza or even the Stoics. It's this idea of an impersonal moral order to the universe. And because it's impersonal, you don't talk to it. And maybe more importantly, you don't ask it for favors. You don't treat God like a cosmic vending machine you put prayers into to get a miracle out.
Which brings us to the prayer incident. This is my favorite story in the whole stack because it just perfectly illustrates his attitude towards this kind of religious ritual. So Confucius gets sick, right?
Yes, he falls grievously ill. The text makes it sound like he's on his deathbed. And you have to put yourself in that mindset. At that time, if you got sick, the immediate response was to assume you'd upset some spirit. You needed to perform a sacrifice or offer a prayer to appease whatever ghost was giving you the fever.
Of course. So his disciple, Lu, who we should probably mention, is kind of the action hero disciple, always eager and trying to do the right thing.
Yes, very loyal, very earnest.
Lu asks if he can offer prayers for Confucius. He wants to do something to save his teacher.
And Confucius, even lying there on his sickbed, is skeptical. His first response is to ask, is there a precedent for this?
Ah, is that a thing?
Basically, is that really something we do? Does it work?
And Sulu, he's ready. He says yes. There's a eulogy that says we should pray to the spirits of heaven and earth. He's got his sources lined up. He's pleading.
And this is the punchline. This is the whole thing in a nutshell. Confucius replies, my prayers began long ago, and he refuses the ritual.
My prayers began long ago.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
what does that mean? He wasn't secretly praying in his room every night.
No, not at all. He meant his life, his conduct, his daily adherence to truth and morality and self-improvement. That was the prayer. He believed that if you live a life in accordance with the moral truth, what he called the way or the Tao, you don't need to ask for extra credit when you get sick.
You're already aligned.
You have already aligned yourself with heaven, with the natural order. He completely bypassed the need for mediation. He didn't need a priest or a ritual to bridge the gap between him and the divine because his virtuous life was the bridge.
That is a massive flex, as they say.
Yeah.
To be on your deathbed and essentially say, I don't need to pray for forgiveness or help because I've been doing the work every single day of my life. This incredibly confident stance on one's own morality.
It is, and it just reinforces this idea of him as a secular saint. He respected the spirits, but he kept them at a very distinct distance. The actual quote Giles uses is, respect supernatural beings, but keep aloof from them.
Keep aloof. That's such a great phrase. It's like, give them a polite nod from across the room, but don't invite them to your dinner party.
Exactly. Acknowledge they might be there, but don't let them run your affairs. Don't let superstition dictate your government or your personal choices. I mean, that's a radical stance for 500 BC, and honestly, it's still a pretty radical idea today in many parts of the world. He's saying that human problems require human solutions, not magical ones.
It really is. But, okay, this raises the big objection, the one that religious critics always throw at secularists and humanists. If you take God out of the equation, if there's no big judge in the sky, no heaven to win, no hell to fear, doesn't morality just collapse? Why would anyone bother being good if there's no ultimate cosmic consequence?
And that is the Comte comparison that Lionel Giles makes in his introduction, which is so insightful. He compares Confucius to Auguste Comte, the French philosopher who founded positivism in the 19th century. Comte tried to create a religion of humanity, a totally secular moral system. Giles argues that Confucianism is actually a more advanced stage of civilization than biblical Christianity for this exact reason.
Ooh, shots fired. More advanced. That's a bold claim to make.
It is a very bold claim.
Yeah.
But his argument is that a morality that requires a bribe, like heaven, or a threat, like hell, is essentially a morality for children. It's transactional. I'll be good so I get the toy. Or I won't be bad because I'm afraid of being punished. Confucius asks us to be moral adults. He asks us to be good because human nature is fundamentally social and good, and because it is the only way for us to live in harmony with each other.
So if it's not fear of hell driving us, what is it? What's the engine of this morality? Because you can't just tell people be nice and expect society to function.
The engine is a concept called Gen, J-E-N. It's often translated as virtue or benevolence, or my favorite, human-heartedness. It is the feeling in the heart that connects us to other people. Confucius believed that this feeling was innate. We aren't born sinful. We are born with the capacity for empathy. Egoism, he thought, was the artificial product.
And this is where we get the golden rule. And I think most people, in the West at least, attribute the golden rule to Jesus. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But Confucius beat him to it by about 500 years.
He did, although with a slight but very important twist. Confucius almost always formulated it in the negative. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you.
Okay, is there a real difference there, positive versus negative, or is that just semantics?
Philosophers love to debate this, but I think there is a real difference. The positive version, do unto others, can actually be a bit aggressive.
How so?
Well, it implies that I know what's best for you. I might like loud parties, so I throw you a loud party because that's what I'd want.
But I might hate loud parties.
Exactly. The negative version, do not do unto others, is much more about restraint. It's about not causing harm. It's a logical extension of basic human empathy. If I don't like being hit, I shouldn't hit you. It doesn't require a command from a mountaintop. It just requires you to imagine being the other person for a moment.
So morality isn't downloaded from the sky, it's uploaded from the human heart. It's an internal check and balance system.
Perfectly put. And the training ground for developing this system, this gen, isn't the church or the temple, it's the family.
The family. This is the part that I think is sometimes hardest for modern Westerners to really get.
Mm.
We're so individualistic. We celebrate the rebel, the lone wolf, the person who breaks from their family to forge their own path. But for Confucius, you can't be an individual in a vacuum.
No, the atomized individual as we think of it just doesn't exist for him. You are a son, a father, a brother, a husband. Those roles, those relationships define you. And the state, the government, is just a family writ large. The emperor is the father of the nation.
And this brings us to filial piety. Usually, we just think of this as obey your parents no matter what.
It is about obedience, but it's more than that. It's the incubator for love and respect. Confucius argued that if you learn to love and respect your father, who has no magical powers, just natural authority from his role, then you learn how to respect the magistrate, the governor, and the emperor. You learn to respect the entire social order, but, and this is crucial, it's not blind obedience to the state over the family.
Right. There's that amazing story about the sheep. This one really highlights the difference between his view and, say, a strict law and order view.
The sheep case, it's great. So the Duke of Xi, a local ruler, is bragging to Confucius. He says, "We have very upright men in my country. If a father steals a sheep, the son will testify against him." The Duke thinks this is the absolute height of justice, blind justice. No one is above the law.
And Confucius is basically like, hold on a second.
Confucius disagrees completely. He says, "In my country, uprightness is different. A father hides the guilt of his son, and a son hides the guilt of his father."
That is wild.
Yeah.
To a modern ear, that sounds like he's endorsing corruption. He's saying, don't rat out your dad.
He is. He's saying that the bond of blood, the loyalty to your kin, is the absolute foundation of all other morality. If you are willing to send your own father to jail over a single sheep, you have broken the most fundamental human connection. You've chosen an abstract law over a concrete, loving relationship. Confucius believes that true uprightness protects the vulnerable unit of the family first. If the family breaks, the state breaks.
It's a fascinating tension. Loyalty versus legality. It really challenges our modern idea that justice is supposed to be blind. Confucius says justice shouldn't be blind, it should see the relationship. But let's zoom out to that state level. Because Confucius spent his whole life trying to get into politics, he wanted to run things, but his view of government was, well, it was pretty unique for a time of brutal warlords.
He lived in a time of pure, realpolitik, where might makes right. The guy with the biggest army wins. But Confucius believed in government by virtue. He had this radical idea that if a ruler was truly good, personally virtuous, kind, he wouldn't need to use force at all.
This is the famous wind and grass metaphor.
Yes, he says, "The virtue of the prince is like unto wind, that of the people like unto grass. For it is the nature of grass to bend when the wind blows upon it."
It's such a beautiful image. The ruler doesn't have to force the people down with laws and armies. He just blows a gentle breeze of goodness, and everyone naturally leans in that direction.
It's a complete reframing of power. And it implies that bad government isn't a sin against God, it's a failure of personal character. If the crime rate is high, you don't need more police, you need a better prince. He actually said, if a country had none but good rulers for 100 years, crime might be stamped out and the death penalty abolished.
That seems incredibly optimistic. Maybe
Yeah.
a little naive.
It is deeply idealistic. And Giles, in his notes, actually critiques this a bit. He points out that Confucius really overestimated the power of a good example. Confucius himself once said, "Rotten wood cannot be carved," about a lazy student. But he seemed to believe that a virtuous emperor could somehow magically fix the economy and stop people from stealing. History suggests it's not quite that simple. But notice again, the goal isn't religious.
Right. The whole point of all this wasn't to get everyone into the kingdom of heaven. It was to build a harmonious society right here on earth.
Exactly. The end game of Confucianism isn't the pearly gates. It is a world where there is no litigation, no crime, and everyone plays their role in the family and the state perfectly. It's a secular utopia.
Which sadly for him, he never got to see. And this brings us to the man himself. Because for all this talk of ideal princes and perfect societies, Confucius's own life was, well, it was kind of a mess, wasn't it?
At the standards of his time, absolutely. He was a complete failure.
I just love that we can say that. The great sage Confucius was a career failure.
He was a throneless king. That was his nickname. He wandered for 13 years, going from state to state, basically trying to find a ruler who would listen to him and give him a job. And mostly they just rolled their eyes at him.
Right. They want military advice, and he's giving them lectures on ancient poetry and the proper way to conduct rituals.
Exactly. He was mocked. There's a great story of a gatekeeper who asks one of his disciples, pointing at Confucius, Is that the man who is always trying to do what he knows to be impossible?
Trying to do what he knows to be impossible.
Yeah.
That's actually heartbreakingly heroic. It shifts him from being this dry lecturer into a kind of tragic figure who knew he was born in the wrong time but kept trying anyway.
It is. And he knew it. He even had a sense of humor about it. At one point, he gets separated from his students, and he's described by a stranger as looking like a stray dog. When his disciples find him and tell him this, he just laughs and agrees. He didn't take himself so seriously in that regard. He didn't have the ego of a divine prophet.
And he wasn't this stoic robot either. The source material gives us these tiny little glimpses of his personality that are so specific and humanizing. Like the food.
Oh, the food. He was apparently very fussy. The text says he would not eat meat that was clumsily cut.
So specific.
And he did not eat much, but he took ginger at every meal.
Ginger at every meal is such a human detail. Makes him real, you know.
And he loved music. He would sing along with people. If he heard a song he liked, he'd make the singer repeat it so he could learn it and join in. But the most human moment, the one that really shatters that cold sage stereotype for me, is the death of his student, Yan Hui.
Yan Hui was his favorite, the one who really, truly got it.
He was the one. And when Yan Hui died young, the text says Confucius wept with passionate grief. His other disciples were actually uncomfortable with how much he was crying. They said, "Master, your sorrow is too passionate."
They thought it was undignified.
They were judging him by the very starch we talked about at the beginning.
So what did he say to them?
He just snapped back at them. "Is it too passionate? Whose death should be a cause for violent grief, if not this man's?" It shows a man of deep, overwhelming feeling. He wasn't preaching detachment like the Buddhists or the Stoics might have. He was preaching connection. And when that connection broke, it devastated him.
It is so ironic, isn't it? Here's this deeply human, emotional, ginger-eating, music-loving guy who failed at politics. And yet he ends up being worshipped almost like the very gods he was so careful to ignore.
That is the ultimate irony. There's a moment where one of his disciples, a guy named Su Kung, tries to paint him as being divine. He says the master must be endowed by heaven with his wisdom, and Confucius corrects him immediately. He insists, "In me, knowledge is not innate." He says, "I am simply one who loves the past and works hard to understand it." He attributed all of his wisdom to good old-fashioned hard work, not divine revelation.
He didn't want to be a prophet. He wanted to be a teacher.
Exactly. And there's one quote that I think just sums up his entire worldview. He says, "I will not be grieved that other men do not know me. I will be grieved that I do not know other men." It's a purely humanistic concern. He didn't care about fame or divine approval. He cared about understanding his fellow human beings.
So after all this, what does this all mean for us? We've looked at the mistranslations, his refusal to pray, his secular morality, and the very human man behind it all. Where does that leave us?
I think what we're looking at is maybe the first great attempt in recorded history to build an entire civilization on humanism. Confucius bet everything on a single radical idea, that you don't need a god to make people good. He bet that human nature, when it's properly cultivated through family, education, and ritual, is enough.
You replaced God with nature, prayer with action, and the afterlife with legacy.
That's it, exactly. And he built a system that has lasted for 2,500 years. Empires rose and fell, dynasties collapsed, but the Confucian moral structure survived. And it survived without a pope, without a Mecca, without a supernatural enforcer. It survived because it appeals to that social instinct that he believed is in all of us.
So here is the question we are left with. Confucius believed that if you strip away the fear of hell and the promise of heaven, people will still choose to be good simply because it is their nature. Looking at the world today, do you think he was right about us, or was that his one great delusion?
That is the gamble of humanism, isn't it?
It certainly is. This has been Thinking Deeper by 6-7.